Welcome to the Deep Dive. We do the heavy lifting, sifting through research to bring you the insights you actually need.
That's right. No more endless scrolling. We find the core stuff and tailor it for you.
And today we're focusing on something really vital if you're just getting into bow hunting. Think of this as your shortcut to understanding arrow effectiveness.
Exactly. We're going deep into Dr. Ed Ashby's 2007 study update, part 5. It's a goldmine of information, especially for the novice bow hunter. Helps you figure out what really matters for making an arrow work.
Okay, let's set the stage then. Our mission for you, the listener, today is pretty straightforward, but honestly essential. It's about understanding what truly makes a hunting arrow penetrate.
Yeah, we're aiming to cut through some of the marketing noise, get down to the basics.
We'll look at arrow design, specifically this thing called extreme FOC, and how it impacts performance. We'll tackle that age-old debate, momentum versus kinetic energy.
We'll also get into how broadheads actually function mechanically and, probably most importantly,
What does all this mean when you're standing there trying to pick out your arrows?
right, because what's fascinating right off the bat is how this study challenges some, common assumptions. It really pushes you to look at the actual evidence.
To understand the why behind it, not just what sounds good or what you've heard.
Precisely, not just relying on intuition or, what the ads say.
Okay, let's jump right in. This extreme FOC concept. Part 4 of Ashby's study already hinted it was a big deal, right?
It did, yeah. The data was pointing pretty strongly towards arrows with extreme FOC. That means a balance point way up front having a significant advantage in terminal performance.
And there was a pretty striking example mentioned.
There was. A 54-pound bow using these extreme FOC arrows actually outperformed a much heavier 82-pound bow that was using what the study called common arrows.
Oh, hang on. A 54 beating an 82. That's significant.
Yeah.
So for a novice, the immediate question is, does this mean I don't need a heavy bow?
That's a perfectly logical question. But no, the study isn't saying heavy bows are pointless. What it highlights is that the potential of a heavier bow isn't automatic. You still need the right arrow setup to unlock that potential.
So heavy bow shooters can still get their advantage,
Right.
but they also need to optimize their arrows, maybe using extreme FOC too.
Exactly. You want to maximize your whole system's efficiency, whatever your draw weight. A heavier bow gives you more to work with, but you've got to work with it effectively.
Got it. So optimizing the system. Now you mentioned analyzing test outcomes. Why is that so crucial for someone starting out instead of just, say, asking buddies what they use?
Well, looking at controlled tests like Ashby's helps you see which factors actually affect how an arrow penetrates, how they affect it, and importantly, by how much.
It gives you a framework.
Right. Without that understanding, choosing arrows becomes, kind of a gamble. You might base it on just luck or stories of successful shots which never tell you about the ones that failed, or you just believe the hype from manufacturers.
Okay, moving away from guesswork towards understanding the mechanics. Let's talk momentum and penetration, specifically with these extreme FOC arrows. The study set up a test with 3 different bows.
That's right. They used extreme FOC arrows shot from 54-pound, 70-pound, and 82-pound bows.
Standard condition.
Yep, broadside shots at 20 yards into trophy-sized male buffalo, real-world test subjects.
And what jumped out from those results initially?
One of the first key observations was about hitting the offside rib, a pretty significant penetration barrier. With the 70-pound bow, about a third of the arrows actually reached that far but stopped there.
Okay, so they got deep, but not all the way through that final bone.
Right. But here's the kicker. With the 82-pound bow, using its specific extreme FOC setup, 100% every single arrow passed through that offside rib. Full pass-throughs, exit wounds, exceeding the measurable depth.
That is a massive difference in performance. What about the force involved, the momentum?
Okay, measured that too. Going from the 54-pound setup to the 70-pound setup, the momentum increase was 0.056 slug feet per second.
Okay.
Interestingly, the jump from the 70-pound to the 82-pound setup was actually a bit less, 0.046 slug feet per second.
Huh. So less of a momentum gain between the 2 heavier bows.
Yeah, and the study noted the draw force increase was also smaller between the 82 and 70 compared to the 70 and 54. Also worth noting. The arrows for the 54 and 70-pound bows were dimensionally almost identical.
But the 82-pound arrows were different.
They were. Same outside diameter, but a different, stronger shaft design internally footed. They were also heavier, but not hugely so. Only about 66 grains more than the 54's arrow and 34 grains more than the 70's.
So slightly heavier. What else?
The really significant difference for that 82-pound setup was the broadhead. They used a modified grizzly, which has a much, much higher mechanical advantage MA than the standard 190 grain grizzly used on the other two.
Ah, MA, mechanical advantage. We need to unpack that.
Yeah.
So heavier bow, slightly heavier arrow, much more efficient broadhead equals complete pass-throughs. Seems logical, but let's look closer.
Right. And the study brings up this general principle observed before about momentum and penetration with, like, arrows.
What does like arrows mean here for a beginner?
It basically means arrows that are very similar in design shaft, fletching, point weight, overall profile. In Ashby's earlier tests, when using the same bow but changing arrow weight and thus momentum, he found a really consistent pattern,
Twice.
a near-perfect one-to-one relationship. If you increase momentum by, say, 10%, usually by adding mass, you got roughly a 10% increase in penetration depth. Very predictable in those specific conditions.
Okay, but this buffalo test was different because they used different bows for the 54 and 70-pound like arrows.
Exactly. So the momentum increase for the 70-pound arrow set wasn't just from mass. It was mostly from higher velocity because of the stronger bow.
So how did that play out?
Well, the 70-pound arrows had about 13.3% more impact momentum than the 54-pound arrows. Based on the old rule, you'd expect about a 13% penetration gain.
Makes sense. Did they see that?
Not quite. If you calculate the potential penetration gain, kind of normalizing for those arrows that stopped at the rib, it works out to about 13.2%, very close to 1-to-1.
Okay.
But if you look at the actual measured penetration depth of the arrows that didn't hit the barrier, the increase was only about 7%.
Only 7%. That's way off the 13.3% momentum increase.
It is. It's only about 52-53% of the momentum gain translating into actual measured penetration gain. This is a big clue that maybe momentum gained primarily through velocity isn't quite the same as momentum gained through mass when it comes to pushing through tissue.
Why would that be? What's slowing it down?
It likely comes down to tissue resistance, especially at higher speeds. We'll definitely circle back to that. It's a key concept.
All right. Now, the 82-pound bow data. You said we can't directly compare its momentum effect. Why not?
Two main reasons. First, that different broadhead with the super high mechanical advantage, that changes the efficiency equation significantly.
Right. Not comparing like systems anymore.
Exactly. And second, all the shots went completely through, exceeding the maximum measurable penetration, so we don't even know how much further they would have gone.
So we can't isolate the momentum effect there, but it's still useful.
Oh, absolutely. It's a fantastic example of how dramatically arrow efficiency, especially from the broadhead's MA, can influence the outcome. It acts like a force and time multiplier.
Okay, let's focus on that. Mechanical advantage, MA. The 82 wasn't massively more powerful than the 70 in terms of momentum gain, but the penetration was night and day. Explain MA simply for a novice.
Think of MA as how well the broadhead converts the arrow's pushing force into cutting force. A higher MA means it slices more easily.
Like a sharper knife needs less effort to cut.
Exactly like that. The modified Grizzly on the 82-pound setup had, I think, a 7.4-degree main blade angle, much shallower than the standard Grizzly. It was 1 inch wide, but 3.15 inches long.
So longer and narrower wedge.
Right. It requires less force to separate tissue fibers. So even though the 82-pound arrow only had about 10% more momentum and maybe 15% more kinetic energy than the 70-pound arrow,
The measured penetration gain was huge.
the measurable gain was nearly 44%. And remember, that's just hitting the limit. The true gain was likely much higher. That massive difference is primarily down to the higher MA of that broadhead.
So it's not just raw power, it's how efficiently that power is used for cutting.
Precisely. Higher MA means the arrow's force does more work penetrating tissue. It also increases the time of impulse, how long the arrow effectively applies force as it penetrates. Force and time multiply each other's effect.
That connects back to impulse mechanics mentioned in earlier Ashby updates, doesn't it? Unlike kinetic energy.
Exactly. Kinetic energy doesn't really account for MA or the duration of force application. Impulse mechanics do.
Okay, let's tackle kinetic energy head on then.
Yeah.
The study introduces this KE to penetration ratio. What's the idea there?
It's basically a look-back calculation. After the arrow has penetrated, you figure out how many foot-pounds of kinetic energy it spent for each inch it traveled through the animal.
Like gas mileage for an arrow.
That's the analogy they use. Like calculating MPG after your trip. A lower number means the arrow was more fuel efficient. It used less energy per inch of penetration.
So you can't use it to predict performance, only analyze it afterwards.
Correct. It reflects both the arrow's efficiency and how much resistance the tissue offered the steepness of the hill it had to climb.
So how did the 54 and 70-pound extreme FOC arrows compare using this ratio? They were pretty similar arrows, just different speeds.
Right. The 70-pound arrows were about 16% faster and had nearly 23% more kinetic energy at impact.
Hmm.
Remember, velocity gets squared in the KE formula.
Okay, more energy, so they should be more efficient.
You might think so, but no. The 54-pound arrows had a ratio of 1.89 foot-pounds per inch. The 70-pound arrows were higher, at 2.16 foot-pounds per inch.
So the faster, higher energy arrows actually use more energy per inch, about 14% more fuel.
That's right. Even when they adjusted the 70-pound data to account for the arrows stopped by the rib, the ratio was still higher, around 2.04.1, meaning they still used about 8% more energy per inch.
Whichever way you slice it, the slower 54-pound arrows got better mileage from their kinetic energy.
Correct. Which seems paradoxical. Same arrow design, slightly more mass, higher FOC. Why would the faster ones be less efficient?
And the answer is?
Tissue resistance. The study strongly argues that the faster an arrow hits, the greater the resistance it encounters from the tissue.
Ah, okay. This is critical for beginners often chasing speed. Faster isn't always better for penetration because the animal fights back harder.
Exactly, and it's not just a little harder. The resistance increases exponentially with velocity.
Exponentially. Like, give me an example.
Okay, the study cites calculations. A 50% increase in speed could lead to 2.25 times the resistance. That's a 125% increase. Doubling the speed could mean 4 times the resistance, a 300% increase.
Wow. Okay, so even the 16% speed increase from the 54 to the 70-pound bow setup, that would mean significantly more resistance.
The calculation based on squaring the relative velocity suggests about a 34.6% increase in tissue resistance for that 16% speed bump.
Okay, 35% more resistance. That explains the worse gas mileage.
It does. This phenomenon is called decrement. Each equal increase in velocity gives you progressively less penetration gain because the resistance ramps up faster.
So because resistance increases with the square velocity, and KE also depends heavily on velocity squared, neither KE nor simple velocity-based momentum calculations accurately predict penetration gains when speed changes significantly.
That's the core argument, yes.
So let's try and put it together. The 70-pound arrows had about 23% more KE, but faced maybe 35% more resistance.
Right. And that difference, around 12%, is pretty close to the estimated 8–11% increase in energy consumption per inch shown by the ratios.
But they did penetrate further on average, just not proportionally to the energy increase.
Correct. The actual penetration gains were much lower, 7% measured, maybe 11% average, 13% calculated, nowhere near the 23% KE increase. This implies that the tissue resistance increase was greater than the energy increase.
So the 70-pound arrows must have been applying their force more efficiently somehow to overcome that extra resistance and still go deeper.
That's the implication. Like the car needing a better fuel efficiency to climb the steeper hill, they use their energy well enough to gain ground, but not well enough to fully overcome the exponential drag of higher velocity.
Okay, this brings up a question. If resistance increases faster than KE, wouldn't increasing velocity always decrease penetration, assuming the arrow mass and FOC didn't slightly increase like in the 70-pound case?
That's the paradox, right? But typically, for a given arrow, increasing velocity does increase penetration, just not proportionally. Why?
Why?
Because kinetic energy isn't the whole story of the force available or how it's used. We need to think about momentum and impulse again.
Okay, refresh us. Arrow hits has momentum.
Right. Momentum, mass times velocity, is the available force at impact. As the arrow penetrates, it slows down due to resistance. The total work it can do is described by the impulse of force.
And impulses.
It's essentially the arrow's momentum multiplied by the time it takes to stop penetrating. This total impulse equals the total tissue resistance overcome.
So force multiplied by time. How do mass and velocity play into that?
Momentum increases with both mass and velocity. But the percentage increase in momentum is directly proportional to a percentage increase in mass, but not velocity, due to the resistance issue. Crucially, mass also influences the time component of impulse.
How so?
A heavier arrow carrying more momentum, largely due to its mass, takes longer to slow down. It has more inertia. This increases the time of penetration. So mass increases momentum and time, and then those two multiply for the total impulse. Mass has a huge compounded effect.
Even if mass stays the same and only velocity changes.
Yes, because increasing velocity does increase the initial momentum, forward force or impetus. More impetus means the arrow pushes against resistance for longer before stopping, which increases the time component of the impulse, even without a mass change. But mass's influence is compounded because it boosts both momentum and time directly.
And mechanical advantage fits in here too.
Absolutely. Higher MA is another factor that increases the time of impulse. It lets the arrow overcome resistance more easily with the same force.
So it slices better, encounters less resistance for longer.
Right. It extends the time the arrow can effectively apply its force. So higher velocity increases the initial force, and higher MA makes that force more effective over time. Two identical arrows with the same momentum but different MAs will penetrate differently because the higher MA arrow has a longer, more effective impulse.
Okay, so practically speaking, for typical bow speeds, increasing velocity will usually increase penetration somewhat.
Yes, generally. But the amount of extra penetration gets smaller with each speed, increase that decrement effect.
Are there limits?
At very high speeds, like rifle bullets over maybe 2,500 fifth piece, you can hit a point where more speed actually reduces penetration, often linked to hydrostatic shock effects. But that's beyond typical archery speeds.
Okay, let's boil down the key design takeaways for the novice then.
Sure. 1. Lighter arrows use momentum less efficiently for penetration. 2. They get less net penetration gain from a given velocity increase because resistance hits them harder.
3.
The offset between velocity-induced resistance and the arrow's forward push impetus is greater for lighter arrows. 4. Getting more momentum from mass gives a bigger boost to both momentum and the time of impulse, leading to more useful work done.
And 5.
Higher aeromechanical advantage from the broadhead lets the arrow do more work with any given amount of force.
This all really paints kinetic energy as a poor predictor, doesn't it?
The study argues strongly against it. Relying on KE assumes tissue resistance is simple, that velocity doesn't disproportionately increase it, that energy change matters more than mass change or momentum change, and that arrow efficiency, like MA, is negligible.
And the data contradicts those assumptions.
Pretty clearly. The KE to penetration ratio for those arrows at different speeds showed KE didn't predict the outcome well. The only way to make sense of it is to accept either exponentially increasing resistance or that momentum, especially mass-derived, is the better indicator, pointing towards the importance of impulse.
The one certainty was the KE increase did not result in a proportional penetration increase.
Exactly.
What about the argument that tissue isn't really a fluid? Does that invalidate the resistance idea?
The study addresses that. While technically not a fluid, the observable results, like the exponential resistance increase, are very hard to explain if tissue acts purely like a solid. The way high-velocity bullets cause remote damage via shock waves suggests fluid-like pressure transmission.
And ballistic gel isn't a perfect simulant.
No, it doesn't replicate the force magnitude or transmission distance seen in real tissue. That's why developing better, more expensive simulants is ongoing. The tissue behaves in ways that align better with fluid dynamics than simple solid mechanics in this context.
Okay, now back to the 82-pound bow example. Comparing its KE efficiency directly is flawed because of the different broadhead.
Right, but the study points out that making that flawed comparison ignoring arrow efficiency is exactly how KE is often misused as a predictor in the real world.
So what happens if we do make that flawed comparison, just to see?
If you calculate KE per inch of penetration, the 54-pound bow looks slightly more efficient than the 82, and the 70-pound bow looks significantly less efficient than the 82.
Even though the 82 had the highest speed and thus faced the most resistance.
Correct. It highlights how much the higher mass and, crucially, the higher MA of the 82-pound setup improved its actual penetration despite the theoretical KE inefficiency. It totally undermines KE as a reliable gauge.
And the ultimate example is those light, fast arrows failing on buffalo.
Yeah, that's a stark one. Arrows with 80, 90-plus foot-pounds of KE, we're talking speeds over 300 foots, often couldn't even break the entrance rib on a big buffalo. 75% failed that first rib.
What was their average penetration?
Only about 8 inches, significantly less than even standard, heavier arrows from the 54-pound longbow, and maybe half the penetration of the 54's extreme FOC arrows.
And those 54-pound arrows had much less KE.
Way less. Often under 30 foot-pounds, maybe only a third of the KE of those light-speed arrows, yet they penetrated better.
Now, different broadheads were likely involved there too.
True, but KE proponents often ignore that. The point is, even if you put a high MA head on those super light arrows, which is difficult anyway, could they reliably break heavy bone? Probably not. They lack the mass and momentum.
What was the KE per inch ratio like for those light, fast arrows?
Astronomical. Compared to the extreme FOC arrows, they needed at least 5 times as much kinetic energy for every inch they penetrated, like 9.7 foot-pounds per inch versus less than 2.
5 times less efficient. That screams exponential resistance.
It strongly suggests it, yeah. It's very, very difficult to explain those outcomes using only kinetic energy. It just doesn't seem to be a useful predictor.
So the fundamental flaw is that KE measures the amount of energy, but ignores how it's used against increasing resistance and how efficiently it's applied by the arrow system.
That's the nub of it. It's the moped versus dragster with 20 gallons analogy. KE doesn't tell you the work done. Impulse, factoring in momentum, time, and efficiency, MA, gives a much better picture of the work accomplished the penetration.
So the study's conclusion on KE.
It's definitive. KE, as commonly applied, is neither a useful indicator nor predictor of arrow penetration in real hunting. Momentum, especially for similar arrows from the same bow, shows a much more direct proportional relationship.
Okay, shifting slightly. The study mentioned something unexpected. Flat trajectory with extreme FOC.
Yeah, that was interesting. Observed with both the 54 tag longbow and even a 40 tag recurve, despite high arrow weight.
Any theories why?
The conjecture is faster recovery from Archer's paradox. The heavy front acts like a longer steering arm for the fletching, maybe straightening the arrow out quicker. Less wobble means less energy wasted, maybe translating to a flatter path.
Like how target archers use high FOC for stability.
Similar principle, yeah.
Yeah.
Allows smaller fletching too, reducing drag. The author noted subjectively aiming point on at 20 yards with the 54 tag longbow and extreme FOC arrows. A controlled trajectory test would be really interesting.
Fascinating. Okay, one more. Extreme FOC nuance. Why do lighter extreme FOC arrows sometimes show a bigger percentage gain over their normal FOC counterparts than heavier sets do?
It comes back to impulse and useful force. Lighter arrows generally have less useful force because more of their momentum is speed-dependent, lost quickly, and less is mass-dependent, lasts longer.
Okay.
So when you take a light normal FOC arrow that's already relatively inefficient and make it extreme FOC, the amount of energy you save by reducing shaft flex represents a larger percentage of its limited total force.
The relative improvement seems bigger.
Exactly. It doesn't mean the late extreme FOC arrow outperforms a heavy one, just that the degree of benefit from switching to extreme FOC is greater for an initially less efficient, lighter arrow.
That makes sense. Okay, let's bring it all together for the novice wanting to apply this. What's the practical advice on using extreme FOC?
First, remember the core trade-off. For like arrows, increasing speed by decreasing mass generally hurts penetration potential at typical bow velocities.
But extreme FOC arrows aren't like normal FOC arrows because they're more efficient.
Correct. They waste less energy flexing. So switching to extreme FOC can let you gain some speed without losing the penetration you had with a heavier normal FOC arrow, or even improving it.
Okay, but there are big caveats, right?
Crucial cautions.
Absolutely vital. 1. Extreme FOC doesn't change the heavy bone threshold. Don't expect a light EFOC arrow to suddenly bust through shoulders like a heavy arrow.
Oh.
Tuning is paramount. You need perfect bare shaft flight to get the benefits.
Yeah.
Poorly tuned EFOC is pointless. Should fly like a dart without fletching, with a field point.
3.
The most prudent way to start is just shift weight forward on your current arrow mass. Keep the weight the same, get the FOC up, trajectory should be similar or flatter, and penetration gets a big boost. And 4. There's a limit to dropping weight for speed.
Yes. Go too light, and the exponential increase in tissue resistance will eventually overwhelm the efficiency gains of EFOC, resulting in a net loss of penetration compared to a heavier standard arrow.
Any guideline on that limit?
The study offers a very rough theoretical estimate based on calculations and limited data. Maybe around a 20% mass reduction is the break-even point. If the arrow profile and MA are similar, flight is perfect and you're still above the bone threshold.
But that 20% is just an estimate.
Highly estimated. There's not enough empirical data. The recommendation is to be conservative, reduce mass by less than 20% if you're trying to gain speed with EFOC without sacrificing penetration potential compared to your heavier normal FOC setup.
Excellent practical advice.
Yep.
Lastly, the study touched on single-bevel broadheads briefly. Accuracy.
Yeah, there was a suggestion from a review, and backed up by a broadhead maker, that single bevels might group more consistently than double bevels, maybe due to aligning rotation with the fletching spin.
And Ashby's own preliminary tests
showed single bevels tended to bare shaft tune with a consistent deviation, left for right bevel, etc., while double bevels were more random, like a knuckleball. Consistent deviation is easier to tune out, but Big safety warning. Bear shafting broadheads needs extreme caution and a huge backstop.
They also tested a specific single-bevel shark head.
They did, modifying them to match weight and profile with double bevel versions. But testing stopped quickly because the single bevel edges got badly damaged on impact, right where the blade swept up,
Suggesting.
suggesting that for heavy impact, that specific single bevel design might need much harder steel. Or maybe single bevels work better on straighter or concave blade profiles. It also reinforced that higher MA broadheads experience less peak stress, potentially requiring less structural strength overall.
And that leads into the next update, apparently dealing with more broadhead tests.
Yep, teasing a perplexing outcome to start the next part.
Okay, this has been incredibly insightful. Let's crystallize the absolute key takeaways for the novice listener from this deep dive.
For sure. 1. Properly tuned extreme FOC can seriously boost penetration. 2. Momentum, especially considering mass, is a much better indicator of penetration than kinetic energy.
3. Higher velocity dramatically increases tissue resistance. 4. Broadhead mechanical advantage, MA, is hugely important for efficiency.
5. Be very careful about reducing aero mass when adopting extreme FOC. Don't overdo it chasing speed. 6. Single bevel broadheads might have accuracy perks, but consider edge durability and design for your needs, especially bone impact.
Understanding these points really moves you beyond simple numbers like kinetic energy and towards building a system based on sound principles for reliable performance.
Absolutely. So the final thought we want to leave you with is this. Take a hard look at your current or planned aero setup. How does its balance of mass, velocity, FOC, and broadhead design align with these principles of momentum, impulse, and mechanical advantage?
What assumptions might you have made based purely on kinetic energy figures that perhaps need reevaluating after hearing this?
It's worth pondering as you choose your gear and head afield. Thinking critically about these factors can make a real difference.
Definitely food for thought. We encourage you to mull over these concepts and how they apply to your specific hunting. Thanks for joining us on the Deep Dive.